what is hindering full development is that desire for profit and that thirst for power already mentioned, referring to an earlier passage of another encyclical, which said, on the one hand, the all-consuming desire for profit, and on the other, the thirst for power, with the intention of imposing one's will upon others. He goes on to invoke the principal concept of structures of sin, internal structures and frameworks and systems within institutions which cause injustice and oppression, which can only be overcome by a diametrically opposed attitude of a commitment to the good of one's neighbour. And the value of the structure of sin concept is that it shows how a political economic institution can act sinfully and wrongfully without personal responsibility for that sin necessarily falling on any one individual. And an important corollary of the principle of the common good is that persons and communities who are economic actors are also moral actors and cannot separate the one from the other. Hence, all economic choices, whether as consumers, business leaders, bankers or policymakers, inescapably have a moral dimension, often far greater than the individual may have bargained for. The concept of structures of sin explains how a small mistake or moral slip in the world of finance can do much to harm many people. And this explains why the loss of trust is so destructive. It spreads like a cancer through the entire economic process. Would anybody be so foolish, knowing what we now know about the mis-selling of payment protection insurance policies by banks, as to buy such a policy in the future simply on the basis that they would trust the good faith of the bankers trying to sell it to them? Surveys tell us that bankers are the least trusted of all classes of business persons, yet bankers are at the very heart of our economy. So Catholic social teaching is clearly relevant to the perceived need for a better moral underpinning of economic activity. And thanks to its basis in Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy, it has a coherence and even an elegance that gives it intellectual rigour and frees it from self-righteous judgmentalism, emotionalism, subjectivism, and political prejudice. Its fundamental focus is not on money and how to make more of it, but on the person as a moral agent in a market which at the same time serves both the individual and the common good. Now, I mentioned two names for the economic theory which drove the world economy hard into the buffers in 2008, neoliberalism and market fundamentalism. And there is another name we might attend to, the Washington Consensus. This term was coined in the early 1980s to describe a set of assumptions shared by three major players in global economics, all based in Washington: the US Treasury Department, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Those assumptions were framed against a background ideology which was unashamedly neoliberal. In fact, so close was the relationship with the phrase the Washington Consensus was generally taken to be synonymous with neoliberalism. But this was neoliberalism applied to national economies which had turned to the World Bank or to the IMF for help when their economies ran into difficulties such as not being able to meet debt repayments. The Washington Consensus consisted of a series of propositions for helping such governments reform their economies in the interest of their people. And there were 10 items on the original agenda. But in the passage of time, under the pressure from the prevailing ideological wind of neoliberalism, some of those more socially responsible aspects of the Washington Consensus were conveniently forgotten, or at least pushed to the margins, and the Washington Consensus was shrunk down in the wash to 3, which Joseph Stiglitz, former World Bank economist and later Nobel Prize winner, described as stabilize, privatize, and liberalize. Stabilize generally meant cutting government expenditure, including on health and education, and also such things as subsidizing fertilizer for poor farmers. Privatize meant selling off whatever the government did that sometimes someone somewhere felt they could make a profit out of if they owned it instead. And liberalize means getting rid of government regulations over how the economy operated so that free markets could run unchecked, usually to the advantage not of indigenous entrepreneurs, but of international corporations. Let me read from a case study concerning the African state of Malawi. For decades, the World Bank and donor nations pressed Malawi, a predominantly rural country, to cut back or eliminate government fertilizer subsidies to farmers. World Bank experts who urged the country to have Malawi farmers shift to growing cash crops for export and to use foreign exchange earnings to import food. And for years, as a result, Malawi hovered on the brink of famine. After a particularly disastrous corn harvest in 2005, almost 5 million of its 13 million inhabitants needed emergency food aid. Then, Malawi's newly elected president decided to reverse policy. The reintroduction of fertilizer subsidies, and indeed also subsidies for seeds, abetted by good rains, helped farmers produce record-breaking corn harvests in 2006 and 2007, which, according to government reports, led to corn production leaping from 1.2 million metric tons in 2005 to 2.7 in 2006 and 3.4 million in 2007. As a result, the prevalence of acute child hunger in Malawi has fallen sharply, and Malawi has recently been able to turn away emergency food aid. The formula, stabilise, privatise and liberalise, is of course pure neoliberal economics, not least in its unstated but fundamental assumption that market forces, once unbound, were certain to have a beneficial effect with as little government direction as possible. This was an article of faith which could not of its nature be proved, nor could it be questioned unless you were to put yourself beyond the pale and allow yourself to be dismissed as Marxist. That is characteristic of this whole debate. Not to be wholly in favour of neoliberal economics was to be anti-business and therefore, by implication, a communist. We could work through a long list of countries analysing how the Washington Consensus has been applied to their economies, and in virtually every case have made the difficulties much worse. Indeed, it's now largely been abandoned, and had to be, and both the institutions concerned, the World Bank and the IMF, now apply a pragmatic range of solutions to the problems they're asked to help with, often with a healthy dose of Keynesianism. That is to say that it's right that governments should seek to direct macroeconomic policy rather than leave economic forces to run wild. And you'll not be surprised to know that the final deathbed of the Washington Consensus came in September 2008, with the sudden bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers started the collapse of financial capitalism, which shattered the world economy. In other words, the consensus and neoliberalism died the same death. And one other thing is true of these two systems and schemes: 6 years on, it's still not clear what to put in their place. But I think we're beginning to see the emergence of what's been called a new Washington Consensus, very different from the old one. I was looking for words to describe it, and I found the job had already been done for me by Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF. She and Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, have become a familiar pair at international conferences on the crisis of capitalism, including conferences held recently at the Vatican, for both Mr. Carney and Madame Lagarde are practicing Roman Catholics, and both of them apply the insights of Catholic social teaching to what they do in their economic decision-making. Thus, a recent address by Christine Lagarde could almost be regarded as a précis of the 2009 papal encyclical Caritas in Veritate. Because she said it better than me, let me read you a chunk of it. As well as regulation, we need stronger supervision. She said, rules are only as good as their implementation. This calls for greater resources and independence for the supervisors to perform such a vital public duty day in and day out. Yet regulation and supervision by themselves are still not enough. Rules can certainly affect behaviour. Think of compensation practices, for example, but people who want to skirt the rules will always find creative ways of doing so. So we also need to turn our attention to the culture of financial institutions and to the individual behaviour that lies beneath them. Incentives must be aligned with expected behaviour and be made transparent. Why is this so important, she asked? Because the behaviour of the financial sector has not changed fundamentally in a number of dimensions since the crisis. While some changes in behaviour are taking place, these are not deep or broad enough. The industry still prizes short-term profit over long-term prudence, today's bonuses over tomorrow's relationships. Some prominent firms have even been mired in scandals that violate the most basic ethical norms. Libor and foreign exchange rigging scandals, money laundering and illegal foreclosure, She goes on, to restore trust, we need a shift towards greater integrity and accountability. We need a stronger and systematic ethical dimension. In grappling with this, it helps to go back to the ancient philosophers. They would have raised the most basic question: what is the social purpose of the financial sector? Or, as Aristotle would have asked, what is its telos? He answered his own question. She said, wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, or it is merely useful for the sake of something else. Or, as Oscar Wilde put it, the true perfection of man lies not in what man has, but in what man is. From this perspective, we can identify the true purpose of finance. Its goal is to put resources to productive use, thereby contributing to the good of economic stability and full employment, and ultimately to the well-being of people. In other words, to enrich society. In Aristotle's framework, she goes on, once we know the purpose, we can identify the virtues needed to fulfill it. It becomes a matter for every person doing the right thing. When we think about finance, surely one of these core virtues is prudence, which is about stewardship, sustainability, and safeguarding the future. Prudence has long been a byword of banking, and yet has been sorely missing in recent times. We know that regaining virtues like prudence will not happen overnight. Aristotle teaches that virtue is moulded from habit, from developing and nurturing good behaviour over time. As with anything worth doing, practice makes perfect. Getting back on the right path requires education and leadership that is sustained over many years. It requires alert watchdogs, including from civil society. Most importantly of all, it requires investors and financial leaders taking values as seriously as valuation, culture as seriously as capital. Finally, she says, as Mark Carney pointed out in an admirable speech in Canada last year, the financial sector needs to be grounded in strong connections to clients and to communities, to the people served by the financial industry. Ultimately, she finished, we need to ingrain a greater social consciousness, one that will seep into the financial world and forever change the way it does business. And so say all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clifford. That was a taster, I'm assuming, of the book, which we could all read when we pick it away. Lots of rich stuff there, lots of rich thoughts, a lot of rich principles for us to take into our thinking on business and practice. So to open up the discussion now, I'm going to sit down here, that's okay, and take a few comments, questions, have a discussion perhaps as much as a question and answers on the principles here, how Catholic socialism teaching has been applied to business, the rich ideas of principles and virtue, which is a sort of earlier on we heard was a very English approach to the business thinking. So let's open it up now to questions and comments.